Hey guys, so another day, another section of our giant flowchart. Today we're going to be going over the adrenal glands. So in this lesson on the adrenal glands, we're going to be talking about how the endocrine system responds to stress compared to how the nervous system responds to stress. We're also going to look at the two different parts of the adrenal glands and their different functions. We're going to talk about how epinephrine and norepinephrine affect the body, as well as how the adrenal cortex is stimulated and what its hormones are, how they affect the body. So the adrenal glands are the endocrine glands that are responsible for the body's stress response. They work with the sympathetic nervous system to respond to stressful situations. So the sympathetic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that's responsible for your fight or flight response. And because the nervous system is sending electrical impulses, which can move very quickly, the nervous system can work very, very fast in responding to a stressful situation. It's going to bump up your heart rate, your breathing rate, flood your blood with some glucose, that kind of stuff. The endocrine response is going to do the same things to your body, and it's going to be more slow at doing that because it has to, send different signals through your blood to release your stress hormones, and then they have to travel through your blood to different areas. But the response can last much longer. So if the stress is, a more prolonged stress and isn't over in an instant, then you would want that endocrine response. So if it's just like, a jump scare, then the nervous system's quick response is excellent and you don't need it to last very long. But if it's like, a serial killer chasing you through the woods and you need to be able to sustain your running pace for a while, then you would want that endocrine response to kick in. Hormones from the adrenal gland regulate your responses to both short-term stress, which would be both the jump scare and the running through the woods, and long-term stress, which is a stress that would last days or weeks or months, like a much longer term stress. We do have two different adrenal glands. They are on top of the two kidneys that you have. Those little hats on top of the kidneys are your adrenal glands. The adrenal glands have two sections. They have the adrenal cortex, which goes around the outside, and then in the middle you have the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla helps regulate the body's short-term stress response. Again, it's a more prolonged stress response than what the sympathetic nervous system alone can do, but it is still short-term. We're talking like minutes, maybe an hour, not like days. The adrenal medulla is stimulated by neurons from the hypothalamus. So with a lot of the endocrine system, it's stimulated by hormones that are coming from the hypothalamus, those like releasing factors. But with your short-term stress response, you want to get it started as quickly as possible. So the hypothalamus will send a nerve impulse directly to the adrenal medulla. That'll cause the adrenal medulla to release its stress hormones, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are also called adrenaline and noradrenaline. Both of those are protein hormones. They attach to the same endocrine receptors, and they're just going to prepare the body for that stressful situation, essentially the exact same way that the sympathetic nervous system does. However, the effects of the sympathetic nervous system can last, like seconds, few minutes. The epinephrine and norepinephrine can last about 10 times longer. They provide more ATP energy to the body to respond to danger, which is important if you need to run or fight, that your muscles have lots of ATP energy available to them. It's also going to increase your breathing rate, increase your heart rate, increase your blood pressure. It's going to cause your bronchioles to dilate so that you can get more air into your lungs. It's going to increase your blood glucose so that you have that energy available for cellular respiration, so your cells can get lots of energy. Your pupils dilate so that they can take in more information. And yeah, epinephrine does act very quickly once it starts getting around the body. If someone is in cardiac arrest, sometimes epinephrine is used to try and stimulate the heart and get it pumping again. And it's also in an EpiPen. That's what epi and EpiPen stands for, is epinephrine. And that's because when someone's in anaphylactic shock from an allergy, their airways tend to close, which can be really deadly, and their blood pressure tends to drop, which can also be deadly. And epinephrine is going to open up their bronchioles, so open up some of their breathing passages, while also increasing their blood pressure. Okay, the adrenal cortex is then the outside of the adrenal gland, and it's going to help regulate the body's long-term stress response. So hours, days, months, it can keep pumping out its hormones. So in this case, the hypothalamus is going to send its releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. That stimulates the anterior pituitary to release ACT-H, also called adrenocorticotropic hormone. The adrenocorticotropic hormone is a tropic hormone that goes to the adrenal cortex, and it causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid hormone. That is a steroid hormone, and it's going to do a couple things, including increase blood glucose levels. So yeah, the cortisol is like the main long-term stress hormone released by the adrenal cortex. It's going to cause proteins to break down into amino acids, and then those amino acids get converted into glucose. It's also going to cause fat cells to break down, which releases glucose. So all of it is just trying to increase your blood glucose levels so that that glucose is available for cellular respiration, so your cells can make ATP energy. Cortisol is also anti-inflammatory. So if you have an injury, that type of stress, like any physical injury is a stress on your body. So that type of stress is going to cause swelling and stuff like that. And a few days after the injury, cortisol is going to be released from the adrenal cortex to reduce that swelling. Cortisol is an anti-inflammatory. Sometimes like people who have, really painful like joints or breaks that didn't heal properly or something like that might get like a cortisol shot to try and like reduce the inflammation and the pain and stuff like that. Cortisol also increases blood glucose levels in order to help that tissue like repair itself. And then as levels of cortisol get really high in the blood, it is going to cause a negative feedback loop, which will go to the hypothalamus and stop the hypothalamus from stimulating the anterior pituitary. So your ACT-H levels will then drop, and then eventually your cortisol levels will drop as well. The main downsides of having high stress levels just like all the time is with that really high cortisol level in your blood all of the time, it does increase your chances of infection because inflammation is one of the ways our bodies fight infection, and cortisol is anti-inflammatory. By having high cortisol levels in your blood, it does mean that you don't have that inflammation response anymore available to your body to fight infection. So that's why people that are like really like stressed and run down tend to get sick more easily and more often. Cortisol also results in high blood sugar because a lot of what it's doing is going to increase your blood glucose levels. That high blood sugar can cause high blood pressure then, because you're constantly having like water go into your blood to try and dilute all of that sugar that's in there, and all of that extra fluid in your blood is going to increase your blood pressure. Increased blood pressure then increases your risk of like heart attacks and strokes. So again, stress is a big risk, like long-term stress is a big risk factor for heart attack and stroke. It also causes increased heart rate, because if you're stressed all the time, your heart is going to be beating faster, which can over time be really hard on your actual heart muscle. Okay, so short-term versus long-term stress. So short-term stress, you're going to have higher heart rate and blood pressure. You're going to have more blood flow to your heart and muscles, pretty much anything that you're going to need to fight or run away. It's going to increase your breathing rate. It's going to increase your metabolism. So like you're breaking down proteins and fats and all of that stuff to increase your blood glucose levels. And then the long-term stress response, you do have more reabsorption from the kidney, which we'll talk about in a moment. You're also going to have that increased blood volume and blood pressure, which we just mentioned. You're going to have the breakdown of proteins and fats, which is going to release blood glucose. And you're going to have reduced inflammation, which is going to suppress your immune system. Okay, so the adrenal cortex also helps with blood volume, as we just saw with the first point on this slide here for the sodium and water being reabsorbed. And that's because the adrenal cortex is the part of the body that releases aldosterone. We talked about aldosterone, I can't remember when we talked about aldosterone, but we have talked about aldosterone already in the last chapter. It is a mineral corticoid, so that's just a type of hormone. And essentially, if you have low blood volume, like if you've just lost a lot of blood, that is going to stimulate the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. So essentially, there's receptors in your kidney that can actually detect that low blood volume. It's going to cause the release of another hormone called angiotensin as well, which constricts blood vessels so that your blood pressure goes up and stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. After the aldosterone is released, it's going to travel through the blood to the kidney. It is going to cause the nephron tubules to become more permeable to sodium, so more sodium is reabsorbed out of the tubules into the blood. As the sodium ions go back into the blood, the water is then going to follow because of osmosis. And as you have more water in the blood, then it's going to increase your blood volume. So it works kind of similar to ADH, but ADH is responding to osmotic pressure. Aldosterone responds to overall blood volume. ADH also only causes the movement of water, whereas aldosterone causes the movement of sodium ions first and then water. Sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone are also produced to some extent in the adrenal cortex. Those sex hormones promote primary and secondary sex characteristic growth and development. Your primary sex characteristics are like your sex organs. Secondary sex characteristics are things like body hair, deeper voices, and muscles in boys, stuff like that. So this is just kind of a summary of that. So with our adrenal glands, we have the adrenal medulla, the middle, that releases your short-term stress hormones of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then also the adrenal cortex, which is responsible for your long-term stress response, where it causes the release of like cortisol, aldosterone, and to some extent, some sex hormones. Okay, so we're now on this section right here. So we'll start with the adrenal medulla. So our hypothalamus is going to send a nerve impulse to the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla then releases the epinephrine and norepinephrine, which prepare us for our short-term stress response. So we have an increase of heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased breathing rate. You'll have some vasodilation. Your pupils will dilate. It'll increase your blood glucose, all of that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you're having a long-term stress response, the hypothalamus is going to send a releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is going to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. That ACTH is then going to go over to the adrenal cortex and stimulate it to release cortisol. The cortisol is then going to go to proteins, cause them to break down into amino acids, and then those amino acids are converted into glucose. The cortisol also goes to your fat cells, causes them to break down and release glucose. Both of those things work to increase your blood glucose levels, and then cortisol is also anti-inflammatory. And then lastly, if you have a low blood volume, that is going to trigger receptors in your kidney, which causes the release of angiotensin, which causes an increase in blood pressure by vasoconstricting, also going to cause the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. The aldosterone goes to your kidney's nephron tubules. It's going to cause them to reabsorb more sodium ions back into the blood. Water will follow because of osmosis, and that will result in an increase in blood volume. Okay, so that is it for your adrenal glands.